Hi there, welcome to Active Intelligence. I'm Aaron Ironside, and I hope you'll spend the next half an hour or so with me as we take a look at topical issues from a few different perspectives, and today one that is a concern to nearly 1 million Kiwis living abroad, but for also those who have had to travel during the pandemic. It is the misfortune known as MIQ, today on Active Intelligence. On today's show, I catch up with Randall Hedges, who's recently returned from a holiday with his American wife and family and had to spend time in MIQ. And although he thought he was a great supporter of the government's strategy around COVID-19, he's not so convinced that MIQ was being handled exactly the way it should be. Of course, the MIQ rules have finally changed, the government finally bowing to the fact that there's been a lot of pressure, a lot of unhappy Kiwis stranded overseas wanting to come home.
Kiwi Ali Fabish is stuck in the UK, mourning the loss of her father in New Zealand. News that the MIQ room release is scrapped has hit her hard.
I just burst into tears and I was just like, I don't know what to do now.
While Ali's father was dying of cancer here, she was diagnosed with cancer in Scotland.
I had to do my chemo alone. I couldn't have anyone in my house because of COVID. And I just need that support from my family. I need to see my family.
But she can't. There are no MIQ room releases for now.
It's a delay for a period of time while we figure out exactly what's going to happen at the border.
It's totally unacceptable that the million New Zealanders offshore found out that the New Zealand border was basically shut through a random message by a bureaucrat on a website.
There's just a real lack of transparency, lack of communication. People don't know what's happening next.
So many people are waiting to get their magic MIQ lottery ticket so they can come home. Some, of course, have. What's MIQ like? Is it all that it's cracked up to be? Is it incredibly well run? What are the quirks of MIQ?
They have a whole list here. This is a good one. Prohibited items, and as you'd expect, it's alcohol, drugs, weapons, and sandwich makers. Yes, little known fact about New Zealand is while the rest of the world is dealing with drugs, guns and alcohol, New Zealand is having to deal with sandwich makers. It's the scourge of our youth. But overall, yeah, the room is very comfortable. I've got no problem staying here. A couple of little things I wouldn't mind seeing tweaked. First of all, the internet is terrible here. Honestly, the Mars rover has less latency than the internet in my room, but we're coping. And in my bathroom, my toilet just never stops running. It's so annoying. Every time I have to use that, I have to take it all apart and tinker and push, but we get it sorted. It's all good. Also on the list of frequently asked questions, it's funny, you go through and they answer all the questions, but then again they get to a couple of questions which are obviously a little bit too hard to answer, like how do I do my laundry? We'll just leave that blank. Do housekeeping clean my room? I think we'll just leave that blank as well. And then down the bottom, they've got a couple of helpful contact numbers. The top of the list being work and income, I think because they figure if you've got no internet, you're going to lose your job anyway, so we'll give you this number. And then of course you're stuck in a little hotel room for 2 weeks with no internet and a running toilet. They figure someone's going to have some mental health problems sooner or later, so they include the mental health numbers. No, they don't include that either. So I've been making my own entertainment, and I went down to the exercise area. There's a little cordoned off area in the parking lot. You can walk around in circles. So I went around down there and walked around in circles, and then took a photo of myself next to some of the local fauna and flora. And of course immediately got accosted by one of the other guests who's, these people, he came running across, you can't have a camera here. And I can, there's no rule against having cameras in the common areas. I was just taking a picture of myself. These people. Anyway, so I took a picture of him and he really got angry then and ran off and told one of the policemen. So it's 2:30 now, I still haven't been arrested, I think we'll be fine. And subsequently I found out that, well, there's no rule in here. They strongly discourage me from flying my photography drone in my room.
So some rather quirky bits of MIQ. Remember, don't pack your toasted sandwich maker, because of course that's what everybody has in their suitcase. Bizarre really, isn't it? Of course it's not so funny if you are overseas and you've been trying to get home. Of course for some that has meant resorting to legal action to try and convince the government to make a change to MIQ.
When you say those words, we can't go home. What do they sound like to you?
I feel a bit lost, actually, a bit of an alien to our own country.
This is how we're living. Boxes, boxes, boxes.
All packed up with nowhere to go.
Yeah, we've just been living with the bare basics and surrounded by boxes.
Grounded Kiwis across Australia barred from entering New Zealand by their own government.
We're like the Black Plague on the outside, trying to get back in.
All thanks to a Prime Minister hell-bent on keeping COVID out.
The best thing we can do is act preventively.
Forcing her fellow Kiwis to enter a bizarre human online lottery.
This is it, the Hunger Games goes on.
It is, it's like what you see on the TV as far as numbers all jumbled up and a ball comes out and that's your number.
Hello, what numbers are we going to draw this time? Wait for it.
The tough stance, labelled draconian by many, has triggered unprecedented legal action.
It's important that this issue is tested.
And punctured Jacinda Ardern's popularity.
She started off brilliantly, but the rest, I think even she'd have to admit, has been seriously regrettable.
And I got to admit, we're getting a bit over actually being in this restricted space.
Ashley and Kerry have been cooped up in this caravan in regional Western Australia for the past 6 months.
It's lucky the wife and I get on very well after 46 years of marriage. Otherwise, it'd get even more stressful, I'd say.
They came here for a holiday but were left stranded when New Zealand closed the border because of the COVID threat.
Jacinda, would you like to actually have to do this and be stuck here, separated from your our 9 grandchildren, you know, and our family?
Well, it would appear that things are finally changing, and perhaps some of those people who are stranded overseas will finally get to come home. But meantime, let's take a look back at the MIQ experience. And for someone who just a month ago came home from a trip to America with his American wife and family, Randall Hedges was glad to have the chance to finally go and visit the family overseas, and of course managed to get themselves an MIQ spot so they could come home.
Yeah, we certainly were. It's been more than 2 years since we saw any of our American family.
Did you have to make sure you had your MIQ spots for coming home in place before you could make that plan?
Yeah, we did. So Kelly, my wife, is a school teacher, and so we only really have one window to travel as far as the USA. So Christmas is really the only window that works for us, especially when you bolt on 10 to 14 days of MIQ, depending on whatever flavour of MIQ you get. So we, I believe, were in the last intake for January. We missed all of December, and Kelly was pretty despondent because she felt that we weren't going to be able to get home and see family. And then, miracle of miracles, on what we're pretty sure is the last one, we managed to sneak in.
Okay, so it sounds like the last time you were in the States was pre-pandemic. How had things changed when you got back?
We stopped overnight in Los Angeles because of the difficulty of traveling and only having one flight. Kelly's family lives in Kansas, and I did a little side trip to Florida. So I got a little taste of 3 different parts of America, and there's a lot of discussion about COVID. People who know New Zealand have a lot of positive things to say about how New Zealand has managed COVID. And there was quite a lot of negative opinion offered about how it had gone in the United States, at least amongst the people that we spoke to. And there was also people had a sense of complacency in the USA as well, that Americans have become complacent because COVID had been managed, perhaps for want of a better term, badly. More people had been exposed to it, more new people who had mild cases, and there was something of a, attitude towards it, which was interesting to see. Whereas in New Zealand, we haven't had a lot, so people tend to be a lot more scared of it.
Well, here, of course, we have mask wearing and vaccine passports. Were there similar kinds of things in play there?
Short answer, no. In the airports, yes. There's absolute regimented every airport that we went through. You're required to wear a mask. It wasn't optional, and we didn't see anybody not wearing masks. We took a little side trip. My daughter's turning 14, so we took her down to Universal Studios in Florida, which was a little bit of a risk that we were a bit uncomfortable with. But you only get to do these things kind of once. There, the most that they had done at Universal Studios was to reduce the capacity of the park to 100,000 people a day. And they made announcements that the CDC recommends wearing masks, and that was it. There was no suggestion that we would be required to wear a mask. A large number of people did wear masks, but masks were not universal.
Did you just say that the park's limit was 100,000 people a day?
Yeah, they had reduced it. Yes, they'd reduced the capacity down to 100,000 people a day.
It's hard to imagine that that's the reduced number.
Yeah.
We're very aware of the divisive nature of the COVID topic here. When you were talking to friends and family in the States, did you sense that? Were you kind of cautious about getting into it as a discussion?
No, people were quite open about talking about it. I should stress that my wife's family come from the only Democrat county in Kansas. Every other county is Republican, and they come from a university town. So the cultures in university towns tend to be a little bit more moderate. So people were quite happy to have a discussion with us about what was different between what we had experienced and what they had experienced. So that was so there wasn't. Didn't notice too much tension, but there were people who were definitely not going to be wearing masks, and we're not remotely worried about the implications of that for them or anyone else.
Well, it sounds all too familiar in terms of those who have the same reservations here. So let's talk about the coming home experience. New MIQ awaited you. The purpose of MIQ, of course, is to protect the border so that new variants like Omicron don't get into the country. So we want to explore just how well we're doing at protecting our border. Can you take us through the experience from sort of the days leading up to the plane ride through to the kind of touching down and going into MIQ?
Yeah, so while we were over there, we were originally scheduled to do 7 days in MIQ, and then Omicron broke out, and they decided to extend MIQ to 10 days. And they also required us to get a test, I think it was 24 hours before we got on the plane, which is actually remarkably difficult to do. At the time that we were there, because Omicron was also taking off in the USA, you couldn't get rapid antigen tests. They weren't anywhere. You couldn't buy them in pharmacies or anything like that. And so we got this message that we would have to get our test 24 hours before. So we booked our tests and then found when we got to the airport in Kansas, which is still 11 to 12 hours commuting time away from LA, we didn't yet have our test results because we had timed our run so that our test results would be available in LA. When we checked in on the United Airlines flight, they told us they couldn't take us because we didn't have test results. So we were left with this really horrible sinking feeling that we weren't going to be able to get on the plane. And then in, sort of that Hollywood movie moment, as we were talking to the people trying to beg our way onto the plane, our phones beeped and our test results arrived quite literally in the nick of time. The United Airlines people expressed frustration that the rules change all the time and nobody tells them what's going on. And they're connecting to partner airlines, so the partner airlines all have different rules. So we got through that and we got onto the plane okay, and we showed all our documentation to the Air New Zealand people in LA, and they let us on the plane to come home. We were fortunate to be on a plane that was probably less than 2/3 full, so most of our family wound up with a row of seats to themselves, and we slept with masks on all night, with our heads at the other end by the window to try and do everything we could to keep ourselves safe and be responsible for ourselves. And then when you land on the plane, they tell you, they make an announcement over the speakers. Those of you don't get out of your seat, just wait. You'll be disembarking from the back of the plane. You're not allowed to go through the airport. And then they take the transiting passengers off first, and they all disappear. And there's a short wait. And they come from the back of the plane, they come and take you off, and you get on a bus and you go and have your temperature taken and fill out a bunch of questions about whether you've been around COVID people. And I have to say, at this point, and in fact, at all points in MIQ, every person that we met who was responsible for one or other element was extremely decent. We met Air Force people, Army people, nurses, customs people, all sorts of people who've got all these extra responsibilities on them, and all of them were absolutely fantastic. So credit where it's due. Can't be a very enjoyable task for a lot of them, I'm sure. But they were all really conducted themselves extremely professionally, and they were really decent people. So we were appreciative of that. To paint you a broad picture of me in terms of COVID response, I broadly approve, I'm being very broadly approve of what the government has done to try and control COVID. I don't, we could get into details and there's things I may not agree with, but broadly I'm in favour. But my experience of MIQ changed my view in particular on MIQ. So we got off the plane and we'd had our temperature taken. We'd been through all these people and they take your bags. You don't get to take your bags. They bring them to you later. They put you on a bus with a group of people, one of whom was Sir Peter Jackson, who was obviously gracious enough to participate in the MIQ situation without calling his lawyer. But they took us off to the Pullman in Auckland, and then when we got to the Pullman, we get off the bus, families first, people with small children get to get off first, one of the perks of travel. We had to take our mask off, and they gave us a new mask because the N95 masks apparently that we bought in the USA to keep ourselves safe weren't adequate. And they checked us into our hotel room, and there we waited to get a phone call. We got our first phone call to go and get our first test, and you have to have a test come back negative before they'll let you go outside and exercise. It takes more than 24 hours to get that first test, and in addition to that, when we got our test and we had our time booked to go outside, which we were relieved about, we get a phone call to say, I'm sorry, your time to go outside has been cancelled because there's a positive COVID case in the building and we have to transport them out of the building. So when they transport you out of the building with COVID, they have to wash the whole building down, I guess, is what has to happen. And they can't have you moving through the transit areas at the same time as somebody who has COVID. So we lost our first day. So we wound up being 3 days before we could go outside. And we rang the wellbeing people. There's a bunch of phone numbers they give you. You can talk to the army, you can talk to the wellbeing people, you can talk to the hotel people, depending on what you need. We rang the wellbeing people and said, come on, we've got 3 kids aged between 10 and 14. They cannot cope with 3 days inside a hotel room. You're not permitted to leave. You're not permitted to really open your door without a reason, like when they bring you your meals. So it's a very restrictive experience. Inside the hallways of the hotel, they have these air pumps that are pumping air because obviously there's concerns about COVID being airborne and how to manage it when it's airborne. And the idea, I think, is to create this kind of positive pressure that's pushing air out of the building. But that means all the air from the hallways coming under your door, which I wasn't that keen on. So we lined under our door to stop that from happening. But we did leave our windows open, so we had lots of fresh air coming in that way. My fundamental feeling about MIQ was I didn't really see the need for us to be isolated in a hotel as a family of 5 that is fortunate enough to own our own home in the city. We could have come to our house, isolated ourselves from everybody, kept everybody safe, and created more space in MIQ for other people who desperately need to come home. We're told that the reason for MIQ is to have these, what they call, quote unquote, wraparound services. But we never saw anybody. People brought food to our door. The only time we saw people was when we went to get tested, and you're not allowed outside apart from that. There was a well-being survey that you're required to fulfill every day, and they send it to you on email. And every person in the room has to email them back. So you send them back 5 emails saying, we feel fine, we don't have a fever, we're not, the usual things, about 12 questions. And a couple of them are around mental health to make sure that you're coping okay with this strange isolation experience. I was just left with this feeling, I could have done all this at home. I could have driven to a testing centre and got myself tested, and I would be absolutely happy to do that. I didn't really understand the value in locking a group of people in a hotel and filling that hotel with lots of resources in terms of military personnel and medical personnel when there's a testing centre just down the road from me and we have our own space that we could isolate in. Our food could have been delivered to our house and we could have answered our emails every day to say that we were feeling fine. So I was left a little bit unsure as to what the value of this particular experience was. And remember, I'm somebody who, broadly speaking, supports the COVID idea. I believe in the importance of quarantine. I understand we've got a virus that we don't have our heads around completely. We need to keep the country safe. I get that. I'm all on board. I'm double vaxxed, as is all our family. In fact, we took our younger son to get vaccinated in the United States because they were available there before they were available here. So we're part of the team of 5 million. We're cheerleaders at the front. And yet the idea that, you know, because a handful of people in the past have been unreliable, apparently nobody now can be trusted, which I think is unnecessarily prescriptive and restrictive. I feel like after 2 years of dealing with COVID, perhaps this whole system could have been reviewed and refreshed much earlier in the picture. So I think it's, in my opinion, it's something of a black mark on the government's COVID response. It feels very much like the bureaucracy struggles to know what to do with COVID. And so because of that, we all have to make allowances for the bureaucracy. The system doesn't compute it very well. So everyone's going to have to help the system out, which I think, I don't know, that's somehow to me that it seems, it offends my intelligence somehow, I think. Yeah.
Let me ask you about the mental health stuff and the physical health stuff. Mental health, 3 days locked in a hotel room with the kids. I mean, you said it's not easy. How did they cope?
There was a lot. We have quite strict rules in our household about devices and how long you spend on devices. Those rules went out the window. That was the number. To be honest, that was the number one way of doing it. We moved the furniture around inside the hotel room to create a space so that we could have you could do at least some basic kind of exercises. You could do some, body weight, push yourself, roll around on the floor kind of stuff. The kids had a lot of pillow fights. Because the beds were now all crushed together, so it did prove to be a good platform for pillow fighting. But yeah, it was really, by that third day, it was pretty uncomfortable. Yeah.
I feel panicky just hearing about it. Let's talk about the physical health stuff, because of course the logic is that MIQ is the place that prevents the virus from getting in at the border. You already talked about air coming under the doors that needed to be sort of sealed off because you felt like that was sort of a gap in the program. Where else did you see that MIQ probably wasn't that good at keeping the virus out?
Yeah, so I feel like it placed a lot of people, for example, hotel room workers that bring food to everybody. They walk up and down the same hallway that everybody occupies. And we know that there were COVID positive people in the hotel because they had to evacuate them, for want of a better term, from the hotel. So you're putting those people at risk when they have to go to every door. Now, there are rules and you're not supposed to open the doors and those kind of things. But we also know that in a couple of cases in the past, the door was open briefly and somebody caught COVID. So I feel like this using the same small group of people to perform all these tasks in close proximity seemed unnecessarily risky. If we'd been able to be at home, we wouldn't have needed to have had someone bring us our meals 3 times a day, which is what they do. So that would be would certainly be the major example of what I think was unnecessarily risky behaviour.
And so when you now think about your sort of new attitude, you come away from the experience feeling like, MIQ doesn't really make as much sense. As you said, it's hard to process intellectually, but you saw yourself as being a cheerleader at the front of the team of 5 million. Where are you now in the queue? Have you slid back?
As I say, I paint myself as broadly supportive. So there have been a few different things along the way that I thought, I'm not sure, but it's not my job to make those calls. Someone else has to make those calls, and hopefully they have a lot more information than I do, and they're taking good advice from people. I was really disappointed in MIQ. I thought, I don't really know what I thought I was going into. I think one thing that perhaps people lose perspective of if they haven't been through it you've got almost 1 million New Zealanders who don't live in this country. And some of them have chosen to live far away for long periods of time, and that's fine. And some people were temporarily overseas and they found themselves caught out like this. I think there is I'm not a lawyer, but if you're a New Zealand citizen, you have a right to come home. And I think that may be uncomfortable for those of us in New Zealand who don't like the idea of COVID coming across the border. And yes, the only way that COVID gets in is by crossing the border. But I think we should all take some time to reflect on how fair that system has really been to a group of people who were probably only doing things like we were doing, visiting family, or perhaps they were pursuing studies, or they were following really noble and perfectly reasonable courses. They found themselves stuck overseas, forced into a lottery to compete against other people who are in that same position. We certainly felt a degree of tension. We traveled to the United States not for a holiday. We traveled to see a family member who is elderly and has Parkinson's, and we don't know when we'll see that family member, if we'll see that family member again. If we had not made it this Christmas, we don't know if they'll be there next Christmas. So there we are competing against other people who are in those same positions. There are grandparents who'd like to come and see their grandchildren. There are people who have dying relatives in this country and they can't come because they're forced to compete against other New Zealanders who are just trying to do the same things they are. I think as Kiwis, we should take a look at that and think about whether or not that system really seems fair and just. In my opinion, it doesn't, and it isn't.
Randall Hedges, they're really explaining that MIQ really is a bit of a mess. Maybe that's what the M really stands for. The reality is that you've done badly when someone who is a cheerleader, a supporter at the front of the queue of 5 million or the team of 5 million no longer sees themselves quite as supportive of all the measures, particularly given that at the heart of those measures was essentially a government saying, we don't trust you. This is the nanny state that is such a problem for so many, that fundamentally adults are not being trusted to respond in an adult way. And yes, some people can't be trusted. Some people refuse to play nice. But that's not most of us. Most of us can follow the rules, will follow the rules if the rules are sensible and explained to us, and we know exactly what's being asked of us. But the government no longer seems to trust us, wants to treat us too often like children. And guess what? When you treat people like children, guess how they act? Like children. And perhaps that's what we're seeing more and more of now, in a sense, kind of some social tantrums where people are saying, that's enough. If you're not going to listen when I speak reasonably, I'm going to have to dial it up. And so from MIQ to the protests in Wellington, we wonder when exactly the government will realise that it's time to start treating adults like adults and realise that we want to be part of this conversation as well. We're glad that the MIQ system is finally changing. Next cab on the rank, we hope, of course, will be the jolly mandates that have divided us. Even if you're fully vaccinated, doesn't mean you're in support of segregating the community on the mandates as well. So there's lots of mess to clean up, perhaps starting with MIQ. Not a bad place to start. I wonder what the Kiwis who come home will have to say about New Zealand and how they find it and how different it is after they've been away in other countries. Love to hear your story. Have you been in MIQ? What was the experience like? I would love to hear from you. You can visit the website activeintelligence.nz. Please do hit subscribe so that every episode can come straight into your inbox. And we'll see you next time on Active Intelligence.